Chapter 29 focuses on self-management. This is an interesting chapter because it is one that I think you'll find helps us or you better understand what controls our own behavior day to day. Certainly all the contingencies that we've talked about in the past or antecedent conditions play a role. But what about more complex behavior, right, that seem to occur in the absence of any contingencies? So things like maintenance of a behavior over long periods of time, engaging in an exercise regime, or engaging in a healthy diet. Those may not seem to have immediate consequences that are apparently maintaining them, but they have distant consequences. So taking exercise, again, as an example, I don't know about you, but if I engage in exercise as recommended, there's an aversive consequence. I'm sore and it's not the best, most exciting thing to do. But there is a distant consequence that hopefully I will be healthier in the long run and things of that nature. So we're going to talk about self-control or self-management as a process that helps us understand those type of behaviors. What about things like organizational skills, developing and following a work plan? How do those play into self-control? Well, we will talk about them as being sort of intermediate behaviors in a chain of behaviors that help control future behavior. How do we explain highly novel or creative behavior or varied performances, singular unusual acts? All of this can be described through self-control or having an understanding of self-control. So in our view as behavior analysts, these performances are acquired as a result of immediate consequences, but are extended through the process of stimulus control, chaining, condition reinforcement, and response generalization. All of these sort of concepts that we've talked about in the past. More specifically, the definition of self-management is going to be the occurrence of behavior at one point in time to control the occurrence of behavior at another point in time, a later point in time. So this is really the crux of understanding self-management. That is, we're going to engage in some behavior now to control behavior that might occur later. So a good example is writing a term paper, right? The actual completion or the writing of the paper may occur at some future point in time, but I could take intermediate steps to ensure that that task is not only manageable, but will get done by the deadline. So I engage in some planning, I divide up the task, I'm doing a literature search, pulling the articles, reading the articles, summarizing the articles, outlining my term paper, and so forth. So all of these are sort of intermediate behaviors in a chain that are going to influence or make more probable the final step of completion of the paper. I may engage in some self-denial, things like forgoing movies or hanging out with friends, again, as a step, as an intermediate behavior that will help me complete this term paper. And then, of course, I could arrange reinforcement at the end of the paper. So the characteristics of self-management is the occurrence of some response that has long-term value to society or us as individuals, even though the reinforcement is delayed. So once again, exercise is an example. We engage in exercise, but often the reinforcer for doing so is delayed, right? So being able to wear clothes that you were wearing 5 years ago, as long as they're still in style. But the example being that if they're a small size and you haven't been able to fit into them, exercise will help you achieve that goal. But the reinforcement is delayed, right? It takes time. Also, it includes a non-occurrence of responses that are more detrimental to you immediately, right? So in the term paper example, going out to hang out with friends is reinforcing immediately, but detrimental long term. Okay, so we could look at self-management as including both of these characteristics. So the occurrence of a response that has some long-term value, even though reinforcement is delayed, and the non-occurrence of a response that is detrimental. Again, long-term, there could be immediately reinforcement for it, but long-term, it's going to be aversive. So the definition is going to be arranging conditions so that behavior is less susceptible to immediate contingencies, right? Going out with friends is fun, but long-term, you're not going to get your work done. Skinner actually talked about this, and he referred to the controlled response as the target response, so completion of the term paper, and the controlling responses are those that influence the controlled response. So maybe engaging in some planning or making sure you avoid looking at your text messages, right? Because if you do, you're probably going to be more likely to engage with a friend and perhaps go out. So that's important. You have to understand this notion of controlled response is going to be our target. Complete the term paper. The controlling responses are going to be those that influence the completion of the term paper. So let's look at an example of how self-control might be acquired. Well, the controlled response may initially be managed by some social contingencies, right? We could use a Premack principle, completing homework before watching TV, or analyzing the task involved in the term paper before going out with a friend, right? Then maybe the next day or the next week, going to get the articles before going out with friends, right? So we're arranging this sort of Premack reinforcement to ensure that we're getting tasks done. These contingencies eventually become accompanied by rules, right? So when we think about this arrangement of, in this example, homework before TV, which is the Premack principle, we kind of don't think about, well, we're going to use Premack principle. We'll often set a rule for ourselves. Well, we're going to do A, B, and C before we do D, right? We're going to do this before we do that. So the controlled response comes under the influence of rules eventually. And this is by and large what you and I as adults tend to follow quite frequently, right? We don't speed because there is a rule to not speed. We don't, well, this is more of a childhood example, but don't touch a stove or you'll get burned, right? So both of those are rule-governed behaviors, and they're slightly different than contingency-shaped behavior because the reinforcement is for following the rule. We don't actually contact the natural consequence. Now, of course, we can contact it if we don't follow the rule, right? So for some kids who don't follow rules, even if their parents say don't touch the stove, they eventually do, and they get burned. So contingency-shaped behavior versus rule-governed behavior. When we're looking at self-control, we see that it's a lot of rule following. We generate these rules for ourselves and we follow them because in the past we've been reinforced for doing so. Other ways we could arrange for self-control or promote self-control is by manipulating antecedents, right? So one of the things you'll see is that a lot of these antecedent consequence manipulations are similar to things we've talked about in the past for addressing the behavior of others. So for antecedent manipulations, we can alter the discriminative stimuli. We could add or supplement weak SDs for positive behaviors, that's what the R plus stands for, with stronger ones, right? So these PowerPoint notes, which I think many of you download, perhaps you print them out, they do contain SDs for understanding the concept. But you may supplement your own terminology, right? Because it's a better SD for the understanding the concept. So you're adding your own discriminative stimuli, maybe in the form of notes. Another thing we might do to promote self-control is avoid SDs for negative behaviors, right? Example I have here, taking a credit card out of a wallet. So maybe you're tight on cash because you're paying off your student loans, something of that nature. So your friends want to go out. You have $50 in your wallet and a credit card, and you say, "Oh, I don't, I tend to spend too much when I go out, so I'm going to remove the credit card." And that response is going to control future behavior. So that's an example of altering the SDs. We can also alter the establishing operations, right? So that is the conditions that change the value of a reinforcer, make it more or less valuable. We can manipulate those. So we can add an EO or sort of contrive one, making reinforcement for desirable responses more valuable. So the example I have here, perhaps not the best one, a dieter might buy a smaller size clothes, right? So maybe I buy a smaller size shirt with the hopes that if I exercise enough, I could eventually fit into it. I don't really do this, but some people do. So that could be one example. Or we could restrict reinforcement for less desirable behavior, right? So the classic one in dieting is to eat a lot of low-calorie foods, right? Such that you're satiated and not motivated to eat. And if you're not motivated to eat, you're probably less likely to eat higher calorie foods. So you could eat a lot of vegetables, and it may make eating junk food less rewarding because you're not really hungry. So these are all things where we're engaging in some behavior that, again, in this case, is altering the EO for other behavior. Another common antecedent manipulations to promote self-control is by altering the response effort. So if we want to decrease response effort, we could do so in a variety of ways. Let's just say we want to decrease the response effort of engaging in exercise. So I may set up the exercise equipment in an area where I have to pass it every day, and it's going to be easier just to jump on the rowing machine and do some exercise. So I'm decreasing the effort involved. Right? Another sort of example might be you want to begin to exercise and you're using something like a Planet Fitness. Well, if it's really far from your house, you're probably going to be less likely to make the trip to utilize a gym. So it's more beneficial to get something that is on the way to your house, right, or very close to your house, or on the way to work or something like that. So we're adjusting or altering the response effort to engage in the target response. Another thing we could do is we can increase response effort for undesirable responses. The R- is negative behavior or undesirable response. So we can make them more difficult to emit. If we're on a diet, we might remove junk food from the house. I find that I have to do this. If there's candy in the house, I will definitely eat it. So if for some reason we come in to a point where there's a lot of candy in the house, I usually have my wife bring it to work and get it out of the house, so I'm not tempted to eat it. So I'm increasing the response effort. I could certainly do some combination of making vegetables, apples or bananas, fruit and vegetables easier to access in the refrigerator and junk food harder to access. Another thing that is popular would be to manipulate early responses in a chain, right? So simply either engaging in a behavior early in the chain to make the future behavior more likely, or abstaining from certain behaviors. So the examples I have here are pretty clear. We could, you hear the news and you hear that it's going to rain the next day. hang an umbrella on the door so you don't forget it, right? I really felt like an adult when I began to do things like ensure that I brought an umbrella when it was going to rain. So certainly things like that. The textbook has other examples on page 683. So if you want to save money, you might enroll in a payroll deduction plan, right? Pretty straightforward. So engaging in some responses early in a chain that will make it more probable that you will engage in the target response. Other thing we could do is abstain from negative behaviors when an SD or EO is present, right? So for people who have problems with alcohol, they may not go to a bar with their friends because they know they have a history that if they go to a bar, they're more likely to drink excessively. So simply not going into the bar is a behavior that controls future behavior. For consequence manipulations, we could essentially arrange for others to deliver consequences or deliver them ourselves, right? So we might make responses public so we could contact natural contingencies, or we could explicitly arrange for others to impose the contingencies. I guess I could even imagine social media playing a role where you post that you're going to try to achieve a goal of dropping to a certain weight through diet and exercise. And everybody sees that goal and they're going to check in with you to make sure that you achieve it. But there are various consequences along the way. When you are posting maybe little videos of you exercising, you get a lot of likes or people saying, hey, great work, keep up, good job, things of that nature. Or you post your meal, which is a healthy salad, folks start to like it, and it's sort of motivation for you to achieve this goal. But nevertheless, the long-term goal is public. So it sort of makes you accountable. Or you could explicitly arrange for others to impose the contingencies. I've stated this before. There are some programs, weight loss programs and things of that nature, where as a participant, you have to provide we'll call them the manager, the behavior manager, with a certain amount of money. And you don't get that money back until you've met your goal. So you're arranging for somebody else to impose the consequence. Certainly, we could deliver our own consequences, easy enough to do so. And we could even monitor our own behavior. So let's turn to the concept or procedure of self-monitoring. So this is basically a procedure where we're going to teach somebody to monitor his or her own behavior and record the occurrence of that target behavior versus the non-occurrence. This is a procedure that we could use for the clients with whom we work. Not all of them, but some of them. We could actually teach them to first discriminate their own behavior. Right, so if there's a target response, like let's just say it's nail biting or maybe some form of a tick, we could teach them to discriminate whether or not the behavior is occurring or it's not occurring. Variety of ways we could do that. We could do it in the moment. We could set a timer, and each time the timer goes off, we simply instruct the individual, are you engaging in the behavior or not, right? Or we could have them watch a video and have them say, yes, that's the target behavior or not. The next step is to teach them to record their own behavior. And of course, we have to check for correspondence between the behavior and the recorded behavior. So we've taught them to discriminate. Now we're going to set them up with a data sheet. And let's just say we use a timer and we say, hey, each time the timer goes off, you determine whether or not you're engaging in the target versus not, and you record yes or no on the data sheet. And once again, we as the behavior analysts have to ensure that they are doing this accurately. As it turns out, this notion of recording the target behavior is a pretty critical part of why self-monitoring actually works to change behavior. So it's an interesting intervention. I honestly have never used self-monitoring, but when I was in graduate school, one of my colleagues was doing a study on self-monitoring, and they got pretty good effects with it for some individuals and some behaviors. So we could use it to change habits, as I mentioned, nail biting, certain stereotypic behaviors, maybe even things like daydreaming, right? Am I on task or off task? We could certainly use self-monitoring for stuff like that. So really interesting intervention, and I think you'll read more about it in ABA 512. Okay, that is it for this chapter. I hope you found it interesting. I think you will find some strategies that you could apply to your everyday life to perhaps improve your study habits or improve the outcomes on exams and term papers and exercise and dieting. So again, I hope you found it interesting. I think it's a fascinating topic. Okay, have a great week.